I'm Keith Schilling. I'm the State Geologist of Iowa and the Director of the Iowa Geological Survey. I'm also adjunct faculty at Iowa State University and the University of Iowa. You might realize, of course, that Iowa is the leader in corn and soybean production and confinement in animals and hogs and chickens. But how do you monitor that? We're going to talk about sensors and all the sensor monitoring we've got across the state. We're going to understand about how water is moving across the landscape from subsurface drainage. You probably didn't even realize there was a whole network of drainage underneath the ground that's allowing us to farm the way we do. I've been working in this field for 30 plus years, looking at all aspects of water, nutrient, groundwater, surface water, and so forth across the state. And really, it's not about Iowa, it's about the whole upper Midwest. Iowa is just one piece of a giant puzzle and represents very well all the issues that really relate to nutrient pollution. We're going to capture how important nutrient export is on a lot of things, from drinking water systems to Gulf hypoxia. You understand how that varies in time and space and how those pollutants are delivered across the landscape. And then we're going to end up with, how do we address this problem? What sort of conservation practices do we put in to reduce things before they cause concern? Thanks for the opportunity to be here. There's always a lot of ways to go with a talk like this. There's just a lot of ground to cover, and we could dwell a lot on any one topic, but I'm choosing the opposite. So we're gonna fly through a lot of different things, and if you don't follow something, bear with me. There'll be another thing that comes up soon, just because there's a lot of ground to cover. So we're talking about Iowa as a source of nutrient pollution and why it's important to monitor at spatial and temporal scales, mainly to understand where conservation practices could go in that would help mitigate, reduce that source of pollution. So yeah, I'm with the Iowa Geological Survey at the University of Iowa, and it's my pleasure to be here. Let's dive in. I think most of you are probably aware of the nutrient pollution that we face, and it's a local and it's a regional problem. It's local because your streams and your lakes get impacted by excessive nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. But for Iowa in the Mississippi River Basin, it's a big deal because of the Mississippi River Gulf hypoxia issue, where that extent waxes and wanes every year, but it's a large, low oxygen zone off the Gulf of Mexico. So Iowa is a huge contributor to that issue. In some places in Iowa, nitrate is, or the nutrients are impairing our drinking water sources. This is some data from the city of Des Moines. They operate the world's largest nitrate removal system. We did a TMDL several years ago, and nitrate, which is a standard of drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter as N, it exceeded the MCL 27% of the time. So that's hard to maintain as a drinking water utility when, a quarter of the time we're impaired for nitrate. So that's an issue. So we have the nutrient pollution, the Gulf of Mexico, we have drinking water sources, and if you do a map of the Mississippi River Basin, there's pretty much a bullseye over Iowa. So I know that issues are different perhaps around here compared to what we face in the middle of the country. But if you were a seismologist, this is the epicenter of nutrient pollution right here. We did a study where we tried to quantify what's Iowa's contribution to the Gulf of Mexico. And over 1 year anyway, Iowa contributed 41% of the nitrogen to the Gulf of Mexico. In the upper Mississippi, it was 47, almost half. What's the most astounding, I feel like, is the Missouri River Basin, that little sliver of western part of Iowa where we only had 5% of the basin, and we contributed 72% of the nitrate load to the Missouri River Basin. Kind of astounding. I feel like you could have a sign that says Gulf hypoxia starts here in Iowa. Not sure that one sells, but it's true. And why is that? Well, we are the nation's leader in corn and soybean production. So 70% or 65, 70% of our land is in corn and soybean production. Intensive agriculture, row crops, as far as the eye can see. If you look at a map of the Mississippi River Basin there, those areas in green are row crop agriculture. Did a study a long time ago where we just looked at the relationship of row crop agriculture to stream nitrate concentrations. And you could plot it as a rather straight line to say, if you wanted to predict what your mean annual nitrate concentration is in Iowa watershed, multiply the row crop percentage by 0.1, and you're going to be roughly at the mean annual nitrate. Simple as all get out, that is the source of our issues. But we also have large-scale confinements. So these confined animal feeding operations concentrated all over the state contribute massive amount of nutrients as well, and things like bacteria. So I'm not painting a very healthy picture of Iowa right now, but you got to understand the context of what we're dealing with before we get into the solutions. Focus mainly on nitrate and so forth, the nitrogen form, but phosphorus is equally detrimental to rivers and streams in Iowa and the Mississippi River Basin. Again, looking at fertilizer in the upper left, fertilizer applications of phosphorus, again, centered over Iowa and kind of the upper Midwest, 3 I states, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. So we got nitrogen, we got phosphorus, and E. coli and manure. This is another study that we did on the Raccoon River that feeds into Des Moines, and looking at the E. coli bacteria concentrations there that averaged over 1,000. Of course, most of it was heavily skewed, so you may have a lot of the year where it's fine, but when it goes high, it's really high, tens of thousands. Almost all the bacteria sourced in that watershed is cattle and swine. So can't get away from that for sure. Well, let's talk hydrology. Iowa has been glaciated many times. Many times before 2.5 million years ago, upwards of 6, 8 times. So there's an old glacial landscape that buries all of Iowa, and the most recent glaciation was this Des Moines lobe that we call, that came down from Canada about 10,000 years ago. We call this really recent glaciation, so it's 10,000-year-old glaciation. But when that came in, it kind of leveled the landscape, and we used to have a massive number of ponds, wetlands, and marshes. So, as settlers moved into Iowa, that wasn't very conducive to row crop agriculture. So this is a landscape that used to hold water like this. This is an air photo of Iowa now soon after rainfall, and you can see where all the little ponds and marshes were. But the settlers could not farm that land. Corn doesn't like wet feet, so they want to drain that out, allow the water table to be a little lower so you could plant your crops. So in the late 1800s to 1920, that was when most of this tile drainage came in. Tile drainage is simply pipes laid in fields to kind of lower the water table and drain that water from the landscape. Dry out the upper 4 feet of soil. So typically 4 feet down, and pretty much are located all over Iowa. So I always feel like the people in the upper left there, they earned it. Okay, that was a lot of work. We're going to see how much they put in, and occasionally they bring in steam shovels because the drainage was so non-connected. They had to make a drainage system to drain the water out that they were draining with tiles. So it was a complicated deal, and it's been hugely impactful for Iowa and actually the whole Gulf of Mexico. We have really no idea where all these subsurface drainage tiles are located. Here's a map on the left, okay, which is air photo taken a couple days after rainfall. So you can see the differential drying that happens when you have a underground pipe draining that water out before, it's going to be drier compared to the locations further away. So we use that as an opportunity to say, well, how much tile drainage do we really see? Because nobody manages this. This is all private people putting in their tile. Well, in 2 square miles, we had 56 miles of drainage tile in 2 square miles. You think, whoa, my, that's a lot. Well, yeah, it's a lot, and it's probably all over Iowa. The map on the right is just an estimate that we some folks tried to put together across the nation. You couldn't even differentiate the lines because there's so much tile drainage. So it's just one big solid blue area. So what happens when you drain water out below the land surface? It's heavily cropped, fertilized, and manure. Well, one thing that happens is you've changed how long it takes for water to enter the water table and flow to a stream. We did a study here looking at a watershed in north central Iowa, looking at historic drainage, current drainage, and enhanced tile drainage. And the residence time, maybe pre-settlement, or even with the perennial stream network, was 80 to 100 years. You put that tile drainage in, and all of a sudden the travel time for that water molecule to the nearest outlet was a year. So there's really very little time for processing to go on. So the mean flow length was 20 meters compared to 1,500 meters. So that doesn't allow much time for natural processes to take over. So we reduced the average groundwater travel time, and we have less travel time means less opportunities for natural processes like denitrification to occur. We've done other studies where we've looked at what does that mean for water and nutrient pollution. This was a field in north central Iowa that we got some funding from the Iowa Nutrient Research Center to quantify how much flow and how much nitrogen and phosphorus is coming into that little stream reach from tiles versus natural groundwater discharge. There were 8 tiles, and we put a series of monitoring wells and so forth in that field. Well, tile concentrations were much higher than groundwater, both in nitrate and dissolved phosphorus, this orthophosphorus, but the fraction of the load was just amazing. So almost the entire load was coming from the short circuiting from the tiles compared to groundwater discharge. So these tiles are incredibly important for water and nutrient delivery to our streams. And again, I want to keep emphasizing that, this is kind of local, but this local issue is all over the Midwest, and that local issue is impacting the regional water body of the Mississippi River and Gulf hypoxia. This is the source where all that nutrient pollution is coming from, is this enhanced drainage. We try to quantify this in another few watersheds up in north central Iowa. That map with the pink is actually the Des Moines lobe. So that's the most recently glaciated material, glacial advance into Iowa. And so we looked at trying to quantify the tile drainage contributions to the Boone River watershed. And so from this, we did some work with some mixing models, looking at flow contributions, load contributions, base flow contributions. We'll talk about the sensor network in a little bit, but that was part of the data that fed the end member stuff. We did a large-scale SWOT model, which is a soil watershed model that's very common in agricultural analysis, calibrated really well. So we have this analytical approach and this numerical approach with the model, and looked at how much of that flow is coming from tile drainage in this 900 square mile watershed. And I came up with kind of a way to look at this as these trilinear diagrams. If you're a geologist, you're very comfortable with these for sand, silt, and clay percentages and so forth. But I made it so we got tile, groundwater, and runoff. And then we'd say on an annual basis, what's the contribution of flow from each one of these sources? And the method seemed to converge about 50% for the end member and the SWOT model for the entire Boone. And if you looked at a small Huck 12 or small watershed within it, the percentage went up. So about half the flow or 2/3 of the flow And this 900 square mile watershed was coming from subsurface drainage. And then if you looked at a seasonal basis, which I find very interesting, you could see how the contributions change throughout the year, where you get in the March to June period, the tile drainage just completely dominates. So it's a very seasonal thing. So the flow and the loads will be really dominated by the wet weather season, major ET going on. The crops don't really start emerging till mid-June, so that's the time when there's a lot of vulnerable nitrate loss at that time. We see how that changes across the season, and we get into the late fall, we get more groundwater contributions and so forth. But it's also interesting to say how, if you compare to that farm field that we looked at, and the small watershed, Lions Creek, the Boone River, and even the Des Moines River, where we did some more work for the SWAT, for the TMDL stuff, you can see that the proportion of tile flow scales across all these areas, you know? And by the time you're in the 16,000 square kilometers of the Des Moines lobe, you still have 25% of the flow coming from a pipe. I just find that amazing, you know, like how much water can you really move? That's a lot of water you're getting out of a pipe. So that pipe flow, again, the tile flow impacts a lot of things downstream. But we focused a little bit at this point on nitrate and water flow. The other nutrient that we deal with all the time is phosphorus. And phosphorus is a lot different. There's two main forms that we look at, kind of the particulate form that's based on the sediment particles themselves. So you're trying to kind of track in sediment, and then the orthophosphorus, the dissolved phosphorus, is kind of like a nitrate thing where it stays subsurface. It's kind of a subsurface discharge transport pathway. But the particulate phosphorus and nitrate are very dynamic, and they can behave very differently. Most of the pipe on the field scale are 6 to 8 inches in diameter, usually corrugated PVC with slotted corrugated PVC. Some of the large scale drainage districts, so again, the whole summer talk on how this tile drainage system develops, but there's multi-counties would come together, farmers would come together and make a district. And then they have large mains. So these mains might be 36, 48 inches, like a storm sewer main full of water. And then some you could even stand in. They're humongous. So, yeah. So these particulate phosphorus and dissolved nitrate have different pathways. And then because of that, they demand different ways to look at some of these things. So with we've used turbidity meters to look at particulate phosphorus, and we have nitrate sensors that look more exclusively at the nitrate signal. But to look at the hydrographs from an event in the Turkey River in northeast Iowa, you kind of see on the upper panel, my cursor doesn't work, but the upper left panel is nitrate, and discharge is in blue. Discharge goes up, nitrate goes down. Because surface water runoff, believe it or not, is pretty low in nitrate. So it's all subsurface. So we get a dilution of that with an event. And the hysteresis, you can see, is a kind of a counterclockwise at that point. Particulate phosphorus is very different. We see the peak showing up actually before the peak of the hydrograph, because it's the first flush of water across the landscape. We're going to have higher particulate phosphorus going on, and the hysteresis is completely different. If you see it on just a single plot here, this is another example where we have the discharge in the stage showing up there in gray, and we have the nitrate peak coming after the event. So the event has receded, and we get nitrate peaking. On the other hand, phosphorus and turbidity peak on the rising limb of that. So very different behavior. So now we're talking about two dominant nutrients with two very different pathways, all of which can vary in the span here of a few days, within a day or hours. that presents a challenge. Okay, so how do we monitor that? So monthly grab samples to capture this is not going to do it. Okay, so for particulate, I mentioned that we've focused a lot on turbidity as a surrogate. Works very well. So we're going to use turbidity as our main surrogate for particulate phosphorus. So if we want to reduce nutrient loss at a landscape scale, we need to understand the spatial and temporal transport pattern. So this is just this normal cartoon graphic of a hydrograph, storm flow, base flow over the span of a few days. We have surface runoff. Well, that's the dominant flow pathway for phosphorus and sediment transport. And the base flow part, of which tile drainage largely contributes to base flow, is relevant to nitrate and dissolved phosphorus transport. So we need to understand these pathways because they deliver the pollutants differently. And we see this across Iowa. Here's an example just of a study we did of, say, 60 different watersheds across the state, with nitrate on the left, particulate phosphorus on the right. The Des Moines lobe, remember, north central Iowa, hugely dominant for nitrate transport, intensively tile drained. That's where the loads are coming from. On the other hand, particulate phosphorus is dominated in western southwest Iowa. If you've heard of the Lusk Hills, big hills of fine textured silt, again, heavily cropped. So those are the vulnerable areas for particulate phosphorus loss. So we have, even within Iowa, and this example relates entirely to the glaciated Midwest. We have old and young glacial landscapes, both contributing pollutants very differently. This is as an example. You see where runoff is generated across the nation versus where nitrate loss is concentrated. So we have this idea of runoff risks are not necessarily the same as nitrate loss risks. And so there needs to be some level of accounting to capture that spatial variability. We've talked about the temporal variability so far. So what we've done at the University of Iowa, funded from some partners with the Iowa legislature, some private foundations, is essentially develop the world's largest nitrate sensor network around. So currently, our Iowa Geological Survey is part of IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering group at the University of Iowa. We have 70 sensors across Iowa that are measuring real-time nitrate, beaming it back to the office and getting online within minutes. So this sensor network is pretty incredible, you know. So at every one of these sites, and we have partners with some USGS sites and some Agricultural Research Service, USDA sites, we're able to capture all the temporal variability in nitrate in this case, and also phosphorus with turbidity at many locations in Iowa. So you know, they're kind of pulled out in some cases in the winter. They're getting reinstalled soon in many cases. But if you go search for this Iowa Water Quality Information System, this is a graphic that would pop up. You can click on any one of those points and essentially see what the nitrate concentration is right now. So it's a pretty amazing system. Measurements are every like 5 to 15 minutes. So continually updated. You pull in, this is a location in north central Iowa. It just shows what the last 5 days are. If you click on the annual, you can see what the annual concentration is. If it's been multiple years, you can click on multiple years. You can go real-time loads and say what's the pounds of nitrogen moving past that gauge to date, you know. So you could do a lot of different calculations with that. So encourage you to go explore that site. It's really kind of amazing. But with these nitrate sensors, we're able to do some interesting things and try and quantify different pathways and so forth. So just a couple examples. On the one on the left, we looked at it to to look at nitrogen supply and transport limitations. So we look at nitrate concentrations every single day compared to the discharge every day. And you kind of see that there's a massive supply, and at some point that turns. And now because the supply has been diminished, we have a limitation with transport. So we have this way to kind of quantify those processes. On the right, we put sensors upstream and downstream of a reach, and we can quantify why concentrations are decreasing in that stream across that reach, whether it was dilution or whether it was in-stream metabolism going on. In this case, it was like 20% metabolism and more often dilution. But these sensors allow you to really dig into these temporal patterns, which is very important for understanding how are we going to take this issue on. In many cases across Iowa, there's programs, federal programs, to install wetlands at the outlets of these drainage districts, these large tile drainage systems, and capture nitrate through those systems, okay, and get nitrate loss because of the wetlands processing that nitrogen. This is a constructed wetland, again, in north central Iowa. We put nitrate sensors upstream and downstream of that. We saw concentrations change by the time it goes through that wetland from 12 to 9 over that time, and we could calculate load reductions from that wetland. So it averaged about 50% of load concentration times discharge reduction associated with water going through those wetlands. So the sensors are very useful for quantifying the success or the effectiveness of these different practices. In another case, we had the opportunity through an EPA grant to look at installing sensors in a small watershed just to see how well this wetland was impacting things on a regional condition. This was Mud Creek, and I think every county in Iowa actually has a Mud Creek, and there's probably one of the most common names in the nation, probably. But we had a wetland at the headwaters of Mud Creek, and then we had a series of nitrate sensors downstream in that watershed. Well, the wetland itself was working great. Okay, so we saw major reductions in nitrate there. Graph in this lower right shows the concentration reduction of nearly 80%. But by the time you worked your way down this rather small watershed, the effects diminished very rapidly. So we were able to use that and say, all right, how many wetlands would you really need to impact larger water bodies? And it was a lot. I don't remember the number. It was a lot. Okay, so you could see an effect immediately downstream of the wetland, and that effect quickly diminished. But that's, again, what these sensors are able to do to help resolve these spatial and temporal patterns. More recently, we've got work that we've been working with the Army Corps on. There's some 3 major flood control reservoirs in Iowa. So we've done some work now looking at working with the Corps to see if they could impact nitrate concentrations in large river bodies by how they manipulate the reservoir stage. A whole nother study I could be talking about today, but I'll highlight just one interesting application of the nitrate sensors. We deployed it on a boat, and over the course of a couple years did a lot of boat surveys in the reservoir itself, going through all the little main channels and side channels. You can really see how the nitrate concentrations change as you drove a boat around the reservoir, and say, like in the isolated coves where you had probably warmer temperatures and black silt bottom, you've got denitrification going on. We see low concentrations occurring there. The main channels, you saw very little going on. It was just a flow-through system. But it was in these side channels where we really saw the activity. So these sensors are also very useful for delineating some of these features. I'd love to talk more about this reservoir work. I find it really fascinating. As a geologist, I'm inclined to tell you a geology story of the sensors. So in this case, we have a couple watersheds in northeast Iowa, and this is the area where we have a lot of springs, groundwater discharging at the land surface as a spring. So there were 2 small catchments up there. These springs make great locations for fish hatcheries. So in both cases, they were struggling with nitrate discharge in the spring fish hatchery. The upper panel is a big spring basin in Clayton County, and this is an area typified by your normal karst situation. So karst means like caves, sinkholes, losing streams, and so forth. Shallow carbonate rock, solutionally weathered. We get rapid influx of water and so forth into these systems. The other spring was in Manchester in the lower panel here, and this was a different location where we had kind of a thick sequence of Pleistocene or Quaternary materials dominated by a lot of coarser grained sand sitting over carbonate, and that spring was still discharging from that outlet. So we had two different situations. We put nitrate sensors in both. This is just an example of the sinkholes and losing streams in the Big Spring Basin. It's very typical. There's enough karst here in Mississippi, right? There's plenty of karst. I heard cave talk, so a lot of karst here. So this is a situation you're very familiar with here in Alabama. I said Mississippi, Alabama. Well, if you look at the nitrate concentration, we got two different signals. So Big Spring, again, was the typical karst. Manchester was the kind of the sand over limestone spring. And so concentrations in Manchester, range from 15 to 20 milligrams per liter over the course of a couple years. Really high. Big Spring were lower, and they had different deflections according to events. So the graph on the right just shows the comparison of nitrate concentrations at the outlet of these springs over the course of an event. So in the case of Manchester, an event happens, we get precipitation, infiltration, discharge increase, nitrate increase 2.5 milligrams per liter over the event. In Big Spring, the traditional karst, we had a big decrease and then that rebound back to the kind of the original level after that event. So how do those signals tell you something about transport pathways? Well, in the case of Manchester, in the upper one, we have a lot of nitrogen storage in the saturated, unsaturated zone. Every time a rainfall happens, we have essentially piston flow moving that nitrate out that was already sitting there at high value. So we have a signal in one case that's very different to a karst situation where we have inflow of precipitation runoff, usually with low concentrations, and we see a dilution that happens in that case. So in this case, the sensors were very useful to help delineate these nitrate or the water transport pathways. Okay, so now we've gone through the why it's important. We've talked about the spatial and temporal patterns of nutrients, and now why does it matter? Well, there's a fairly robust field of psychology about the paradox of choice. Has anybody ever tried to go find paint? And you go to the your hardware store, and there's like 1,000 colors of paint, and you're just like, I'm done. There's just too much choice, and you just want to have choose between 3, not 1,000. And I feel like sometimes we view some of our conservation practices the same way, where we'll offer the universe of federal funding for all these practices, and maybe that becomes a little bit paralyzing, or they don't know which one to pick, and they're just listening to their neighbor or the salesman trying to get them to buy or do something. So what we've done is trying to take some of these patterns and kind of link it back to how well we could locate practices to do the most good. Because the conservation practices are not evenly distributed, just like the nutrient pollution isn't, So not one single practice works everywhere, So there's a lot of variety out there. How do we target these locations for conservation practice to reduce an issue that means so much to the nation? I'll give you a couple examples of how we've done that. This is some work we did on the upper Mississippi River and Ohio River basins. So here we looked at all the crop ground in these two large watersheds, upper Mississippi and Ohio, 1,200 Huck 12s, so smaller watersheds. And we said, all right, from all the crop ground in there, how can we characterize that? So we looked at cropping intensity within the Huck 12s, the small watersheds. What's the slope on the agricultural lands within those? What's the drainage class? Do they drain well or they don't drain well? Because that's going to impact how pollutants and water get transported. So across this old basin, we could divide it all up and say across this landscape, do you have high relief or high slopes, or do you have low slopes? Well, that's one way to classify land. You think with high slopes, you're going to get more runoff. Low slopes, less runoff. And then how drained are they? Are they poorly drained? Well, they're going to they're not going to infiltrate much water. You're going to get more runoff. If they're well drained, you're going to get more infiltration. And then these dissected slopes were able to represent kind of the landscape of young glacial landscape with no slope, so slopes less than 2%, versus kind of the rolling glacial landscape with that 2 to 5% slope. So we could kind of divide these two big basins by these classifications. You end up with a map that looks something like this, based on the dominant agro-hydrologic region in that huck, or in that small watershed. You see that some cases in Iowa, we have the areas in red, they're poorly drained, less than 2% slope, okay? In other areas, he's just focused on crop grounds alone. So not all lands, just the locations where there's crops being grown. You see a map that kind of develops like this. But then, okay, great, what do you do with that? Well, there's conservation implications for what practice to use to handle these different things. If you're a high slope and low infiltration, poor drainage, you better handle runoff. So it's the practices that are grass waterways, or filter strips and terraces and things like that. If you're well drained, in both cases, you better start handling source control issues, fertilizer and management and things like that, because it's going to infiltrate and it is going to move. So you either handle it at the source, or you better take care of the downstream angles in the river system itself. If you're low relief, high or low slopes, then you're going to focus in on drainage water management or other things to address, tile drainage. So this is just a way to kind of again, target the conservation choices to the landscape and the nutrient pollution that you have. Well, we did a much larger study funded by the Environmental Defense Fund, where we looked at all the watersheds in the Mississippi River Basin, 35,000 plus Huck 12s in the entire Mississippi River Basin, and looked at hotspots for where we have nutrient pollution, and we wanted to use practices that would reduce flood generation and nutrients at the same time. So we could intersect a lot of these different potential practices and say, all right, where could they be located across the nation? And we looked at 8 different practices and mapped those at a high resolution, 10 meter cell bases across the entire Mississippi River Basin. The combined map is shown. Of course, there's a lot of dark areas in Iowa, says there's a lot of conservation potential. But we looked at things like infield storage. They call them water and sediment control basins, essentially a small little terrace damming up a waterway a little bit. Depressional wetlands, floodplain wetlands, crepe wetlands. Those are the special man-made wetlands to intercept large tile drainage system. Looked at buffers, levee reconstruction or reconnection, and then row crop conversions, both on floodplains and on upland slopes. So we looked at all those practices and mapped those across the entire Mississippi River Basin. Here's just a kind of a watershed in Iowa. You kind of see how the concentrations of these practices differ quite a bit by the landscape that you see. So at a 10-meter resolution, again, all these practices are not working everywhere equally. So they're really targeted about where these things could go. So we looked at that over the entire Mississippi River Basin. But to try and link it to a national perspective, we took all those 10 meters mapped practices and we divided them up differently and said, okay, we got in A, we're looking at states. Okay, is it best to characterize potential practices by state? Well, it's great for management programs. Doesn't mean a lot in hydrogeology world and so forth. Or we can look at Huck 2 basins, so really big basins like Missouri, Upper Mississippi, or and so forth. C in the lower left was like a USDA land resource areas, so they're kind of characterized, but we didn't feel good about that because if you look at Iowa, it doesn't represent a couple spans of glaciation, so Iowa is just a single unit in that classification. And then we modified some physiographic regions in D, where we said we're going to take a fairly standard map, but then add our own element that would capture the different glacial episodes. So we looked at all those conservation practices we mapped across the Mississippi River Basin and say, how do these different classification schemes impact the selection? Well, if you look at the NI, natural infrastructure potential by state, you know, some things pop out, like crepe wetlands. You know, they're going to be located in areas where you have severe tile drainage, significant tile drainage, so Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, and Ohio. Depressional wetlands concentrated in the upper Midwest, riparian buffers, Louisiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin. But you see there's quite a mix, okay? No one practice works everywhere equally across by state. We saw a lot more, it made a lot more sense when we divided this up by physiographic region, where there were clear winners of practices based on your landscape, landform characteristics. And so this is just another way of kind of saying that we need to match the practice with the transport pathway and the pollutant. So again, I can dive into these different features, but I just wanted to highlight though that it does show that there's clear winners in different regions for the practices that should be promoted and essentially adopted by landowners in these certain areas. So ultimately, to kind of bring this to a conclusion, the solutions will always be linked to the hydrology and the nutrient pathways. So it's that same hydrograph we've seen many times, but here I put the practices that might be on different parts of that hydrograph. So if we're going to worry about particulate phosphorus, we better be concerned about the rising limb of that hydrograph, reducing runoff, and focus on practices that work on that part of the transport pathway. So ponds, uplands, wetlands, terraces, riparian buffers, conservation tillage, which I can talk about. On the other hand, if we're worried about the nitrate loss, well, that's a base flow tile drainage thing. So runoff actually has low nitrate in it. Not that we want to promote that, but as we work on reducing runoff, we're going to drive more water in the ground and cause an infiltration and nitrate issue. Well, what do we handle with that? Things like we intercept that before it gets to the stream, usually with nutrient removal wetlands, ditches, controlled drainage, and things like that. The one thing that does address all of it, I'm going to go all the way back to the amount of row crop that we see in Iowa and the Midwest. You know, if we want to handle all aspects of the hydrograph, we got to look at land cover change. There's just too much row crop out there to handle all this this application and discharge. So we need cover crops, we need extended rotations, and grasslands, CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. grasslands. So to conclude, I guess I've been through all this, but this is a picture is a kind of a world-renowned riparian buffer site established by Iowa State University. We did a lot of very fundamental riparian buffer work there that's just phenomenal. That's what a landscape could look like if we were focused in on reducing nutrients at that kind of scale. But clearly nutrient losses are impairing water bodies and drinking water sources at local and national scales. I think that was clear. Transport processes differ across the hydrograph. Hopefully I made that clear. And this greater temporal resolution of monitoring is critically important if we're going to identify pathways and processes. And lastly, just like the nutrient transport, conservation practices differ in space and effectiveness, and they need to be targeted to the appropriate landscapes. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.